This 1919 studio portrait of two twins looks sweet until you notice the shoes. At first, the photograph feels ordinary. Two young girls stand close together in a bright Chicago studio, wearing matching white dresses. Their arms are linked, and both are smiling gently at the camera. But one small detail would not leave the curator's thoughts. The shoes were not the same. Margaret Holloway had worked at the Chicago Historical Society for 17 years, cataloging thousands of family portraits from early 20th century studios. She knew what fit the period and what did not. This image had come from an estate sale on the South Side, tucked into a box with ledgers, letters, and old promotional papers from a long-closed child welfare group called the Illinois Home Finding Association. The girls looked about 8 or 9 years old. Their hair was curled and pinned in the same way. Their dresses matched perfectly, down to the lace collars and puffed sleeves. Behind them was a painted garden backdrop, very popular in studio portraits of that time. Everything about the scene suggested comfort and good care. Everything except the shoes. Margaret pulled the photo closer beneath the magnifying lamp in her lab. The girl on the left wore shiny leather button boots that looked new. The girl on the right wore something very different. From far away they seemed similar, but under magnification the truth appeared. The shoes were made of rough canvas, hand-stitched with uneven seams. The toes sagged slightly, and the sole looked like layers of fabric instead of leather. These were institutional shoes, the kind made in workrooms when money was short. Margaret turned the photo over. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "The Moyer twins placed together. June 1919, success story for annual report." But if these girls were twins from the same family, why did one have store-bought boots and the other homemade shoes? Margaret set the photo down carefully. This was not just a nice old picture. Something was wrong. For nearly 20 years, Margaret had studied photographs that families wanted forgotten or institutions wanted cleaned up. She had seen images removed because they showed hard truths about child labor, racial separation, or the treatment of immigrants. She had learned to read photos like evidence at a crime scene. Every object, every pose, every space told part of a story, and often that story did not match the caption. She adjusted her scanner and made a high-resolution copy, then gently removed the photo from its cardboard mount. The mount itself was printed with decorations and words from the Illinois Home Finding Association that read, "Building Christian Families Through Child Placement." The studio mark showed the photographer was Lind Holman Sons, a commercial studio that worked on South State Street from 1915 to 1923. Margaret studied the girls' faces again. Both smiled, but their eyes told different stories. The girl with the good boots looked straight at the camera with ease. The girl with the canvas shoes looked slightly away, her smile tighter and her body stiff. Margaret recognized that look from orphanage and industrial school photos. It was the look of a child told to smile without understanding why. She pulled her notes on the Illinois Home Finding Association. The group began in 1907, founded by Protestant church leaders and reformers who believed poor and orphan children should be removed from large institutions and placed with rural families to learn hard work and Christian values. The agency lasted about 20 years and quietly closed in 1927. This photograph had clearly been part of their promotional work. Margaret felt the familiar weight of responsibility. She could file the image with a neutral label and move on, or she could follow the questions forming in her mind. If these girls were not really twins, then who were they? And why would a child welfare agency fake a photograph to make them seem like sisters? But Margaret began with the simplest leads. She checked the 1919 city directories and found Lindholm & Sons listed at 438 South State Street, right in the center of Chicago's photography district. The studio advertised family, portraits, and institutional work. Old Tribune ads promised respectful images for families, schools, and charities. She then checked the Illinois Home Finding Association's address and found it had been on West Adams Street, near Hull House and other reform centers of the time. That closeness was not by chance. These groups shared donors, ideas, and systems for managing the city's poor. Margaret contacted a colleague at Northwestern, Dr. Robert Chen, a historian of progressive-era social welfare. She scanned the photo and sent it to him with a short note. He called her back within an hour. "I know this organization," he said carefully. They were part of the Orphan Train Network, but they worked differently than the New York groups. They focused on local placements in Illinois and nearby states. They advertised in church, bulletins, and rural papers, promising families help around the house in return for Christian guidance. So it was labor placement, Margaret said. Officially it was adoption or foster care, Robert replied. But in practice, yes, children were expected to work. They called it character building. Girls were sent to farms or middle-class homes to clean, cook, and do laundry. Boys went to farms or shops. Some families were kind, many were not, and oversight was weak. What about twins? Margaret asked. Would they stage photos to make children look related? Robert paused. I've seen materials that highlight sibling groups, he said slowly. The idea was that 2 children were better than 1. Siblings comforted each other, and families got twice the labor for a bit more cost. But I've never seen proof of made-up sibling stories. If this is one, it matters. Margaret thanked him and turned to public records. She searched for Moyer twins born around 1910 or 1911. She found 3 sets. 2 died in infancy. The third were boys. She widened her search to orphanage records at the Newberry Library. No Moyer twins. She checked the Illinois Soldiers and Sailors Children's School. Nothing. The Protestant Orphan Asylum. Still nothing. Then she found a record at the Cook County Juvenile Detention Home. In May 1919, a 9-year-old girl named Lena Moyer had been sent from detention to the Illinois Home Finding Association after her mother was jailed for theft. No twin, no siblings listed. Margaret checked census records in 1910. Lena appeared as a 1-year-old living with her mother Alice Moyer in a West Side tenement. Alice worked in a garment factory. No father, no other children. In 1920, Alice was listed at the Illinois State Reformatory for Women. Lena had vanished from public records. Lena Moyer was real, alone, and placed by the agency in June 1919. So who was the other girl? Margaret contacted the Newberry archivist, Patricia Kwan, and asked about more materials from the agency. Patricia said a small unprocessed collection had been donated in the 1970s by a board member's daughter. She agreed to pull the boxes. Margaret spent 2 days reading fragile letters, financial books, and stacks of photos. She found hundreds of contracts titled Agreement for the Temporary Care and Christian Training of a Child. Families promised food, shelter, and schooling in return for the child's labor. Contracts lasted 1 to 3 years. Children were not paid. At the end, families could adopt the child or send them back. Margaret also found letters from the agency's director, Reverend Harold Trimble. In one from March 1919, he wrote about raising donations with a new annual report showing successful placements. Donors respond best to images of children doing well, he wrote, especially when siblings are placed together. Another letter from May 1919 noted that only 3 sibling groups were available that spring, and 2 were boys. The bookkeeper suggested focusing promotions on individual girls, yet in June 1919, the agency produced a photo of twins. Margaret returned to the photos and found a second print of the same image. The caption was different. It read, Lena M. and Dorothy K. Successful Double Placement Demonstration for Donors. June 1919. Dorothy K. Margaret searched again and found her. Dorothy Kowalski, age 8, had been sent to the agency in April 1919 after her father died in a factory accident and her mother was hospitalized with tuberculosis. No siblings. Lena Moyer and Dorothy Kowalski were not twins. They were 2 unrelated girls taken from detention, dressed alike, and photographed either to look like sisters. The agency staged the image to please donors and families, but the shoes told the truth. Margaret called Dr. Chen and asked him to meet her at the Newberry. She showed him both photos. He studied them and leaned back. The shoes give it away, he said. They didn't have matching pairs. Dresses were bought for the photo, but shoes cost more. They likely used what they had. Canvas shoes like Lena's were common in orphanages, Robert explained. Children often made them as part of so-called rehabilitation work. Girls sewed and repaired clothing. Boys worked in gardens or shops. Margaret imagined the 2 girls standing there, arms linked, told to smile. Both were being used in a campaign meant to bring in money and labor. A double placement meant 2 children sent to one family. 1 household, 2 workers. It was sold as charity, but built on calculation. If the girls were not siblings, the family was misled, and the children were pushed into a false identity. Their real stories were erased. Margaret sat quietly, thinking of Lena's mother in prison and Dorothy's mother in a hospital bed, both unable to protect their children. Poverty, not cruelty, had torn these families apart. The girls were turned into proof of success. Robert told her outcomes varied. Some children were loved and adopted, others were worked until they were no longer useful and then returned. Survivors later spoke of being passed from home to home, always working, never belonging. The agencies called it charity. The children called it something else. Margaret returned to her office and wrote a detailed report for her supervisor, Gerald Pritchard. She suggested an exhibition that placed the photograph within the wider history of child welfare abuse in Progressive-era Chicago. 3 days later, Gerald called her in. The memo and photos lay on his desk. He looked uneasy. "This is Wrong research," he said, "but we must be careful. The Illinois Home Finding Association closed long ago, yet some of the families involved were well known. The Trimble family, for example, still has relatives who donate to this institution today. I don't want to cause unnecessary trouble." Margaret kept her voice calm. "The trouble already exists," she said. "It's right there in the photograph. We have been showing this image, and others like it, as sweet examples of early studio photography. We have helped continue the clean and comforting story these agencies wanted people to believe. If we refuse to tell the truth now, we are still part of that silence." Gerald let out a long breath. "I understand what you're saying, but we have to move carefully. We can't simply open an exhibition that seems to accuse a donor's great-grandfather of taking advantage of children. We need to frame this in a thoughtful way. Focus on the system, not on specific people. The system was built and run by people," Margaret replied. "Reverend Trimble led this agency. He wrote the letters, he approved the photographs, he signed the contracts. We can't explain how the system worked without naming the people who made it work." Gerald rubbed his temples and nodded slowly. "Let me speak with the board. Keep digging in the meantime. If we do this, we need proof that this was common practice, not just one strange case." Margaret spent the next month working in archives all over the city. She found similar photographs from other agencies, showing children posed with farm tools or standing beside well-dressed families, with captions describing their change from poor or unwanted children into useful members of society. She found contracts stating that children as young as 6 were expected to work at least 8 hours a day doing housework. She found letters from families asking agencies to take children back once they became sick or refused to work. She also uncovered resistance. In the records of a Black Baptist church on the South Side, she found a folder of letters written by Reverend James Mitchell in the early 1920s. Mitchell had organized parents and neighbors to challenge the placement practices of agencies like the Illinois Home Finding Association. He argued that these groups targeted black and immigrant children, and that many so-called Christian homes were places of abuse and forced labor. His letters were sent to city leaders, state officials, and even the governor. Most were ignored. One letter from 1,922 listed children from his church who had been taken from their families. He wrote that these children were not orphans. They had parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles who wanted them home. But because they were poor and black, the courts declared them unfit. The agencies claimed they were rescuing children. He said they were stealing them. Margaret copied Mitchell's letters and added them to her growing file. She contacted a professor at DePaul who studied African American mutual aid groups and learned that Mitchell's church had been part of a wider effort to protect children by creating their own foster systems and legal footwear (NDS). These efforts rarely succeeded because they lacked money and political influence, but they left behind records of resistance. Margaret returned to Gerald with her new findings. She showed him the letters and documents from multiple agencies and argued that the exhibition needed to center voices like Reverend Mitchell's, people who clearly saw the system and tried to challenge it. Gerald agreed to call a meeting of the board's exhibitions committee. Margaret prepared her presentation and waited. The meeting was held in a 4th-floor conference room. 6 board members attended, along with Gerald and 2 other curators. Margaret projected the photograph of Lena and Dorothy onto the screen and explained her research step by step. She pointed out the shoes, the false claim that the girls were twins, and the use of the image for fundraising. She presented the contracts and letters and read passages from Reverend Mitchell's writing. One board member, a retired lawyer named William Crenshaw, interrupted. He said he respected the research but worried about the message. Were they saying that every family who took in a child was abusive? He knew some placements had turned into loving adoptions. Margaret replied that she was not accusing every family. She was saying the system itself was designed to exploit children. The agencies treated children as resources. They sold their labor and shaped images to attract money. Some children may have been treated kindly, but that did not raise the structure that reduced them to economic value instead of people with families and rights. Another board member, a philanthropist named Eleanor Hartley, asked about the children themselves. Did they know what happened to Lena or Dorothy after the photograph? Margaret explained that the records were incomplete. Lena vanished from official documents after 1919. Dorothy appeared in the 1930 census working as a domestic servant in Evanston, but it was impossible to know if she had truly been adopted or was still unpaid labor. Without personal letters or interviews, they had to rely on institutional records, which often hid as much as they revealed. Crenshaw urged caution, saying they should avoid claims that could not be fully proven. Margaret felt her frustration rise. The records themselves proved exploitation, she said. Dressing two unrelated children as twins and advertising them as a double placement was wrong, regardless of whether the girls left behind personal testimony. The evidence was already there. Gerald stepped in and said they needed to think about how the public would receive the exhibition. It had to be clear and factual without sounding hostile. Telling the truth is not hostile, Margaret said quietly. It's necessary. After a pause, Eleanor Hartley said she supported moving forward, but suggested including present-day voices. She asked whether child welfare groups today could help connect the history to current issues, and whether descendants of placed children might want to share their stories. Margaret agreed and said she would reach out. After further discussion, the board voted to approve the exhibition. They agreed that Margaret would continue outreach, and that the final text would be reviewed for accuracy. Margaret left the meeting tired but relieved. She knew the hardest work was still ahead. Over the next 2 months she built the exhibition. She spoke with child welfare groups and learned that while the stage photographs were extreme, the practice of placing children as unpaid workers was common. Thousands of children were sent into homes where they worked under the label of charity or adoption. These practices continued in different forms well into the middle of the 20th century. Margaret also contacted a genealogist named Denise Patterson, who connected her with an elderly woman named Gladys Washington. Gladys's Aunt Ruth had been placed by the Illinois Home Finding Association in 1917. Gladys agreed to an interview. Sitting in her living room on a warm September afternoon, Gladys described how Ruth had been taken after Gladys's grandmother was arrested during Prohibition. Ruth was sent to a farm, forced to work in the fields and kitchen, and returned by police after trying to escape. When her contract ended at 16, she came back to Chicago changed and distant. She used to say they stole her childhood. The agency claimed they were saving her, Gladys said, but what they wanted was free labor. Margaret. T included Gladys's words in the exhibition, alongside the photo of Lena and Dorothy. She explained the shoes, the fake twin story, and the wider system behind it. She added Reverend Mitchell's letters and modern statistics about foster care and child protection. The exhibition opened in January 2023 under the title Hidden Labor, Children, and the Business of Reform in Progressive-Era Chicago. The photograph of Lena and Dorothy was placed at the center, with a magnified image of their mismatched shoes. The opening was crowded. Descendants, scholars, social workers, and journalists attended. Margaret watched visitors lean in, study the shoes, and read carefully. One woman in her early 60s stood there for a long time. She introduced herself as Karen Lindstrom and said her grandmother had been placed by the same agency in 1920 and worked as a servant until adulthood. Her grandmother had spoken about being dressed up and photographed, about feeling unreal in those images. Karen said the photograph reminded her of those stories. Pretty dresses, forced smiles, and something wrong if you looked closely. Margaret thanked her and invited her to add her family's story to the archive. Karen agreed. After the opening, some descendants of Reverend Trimble asked that the exhibition be changed or removed. Gerald explained that it was based on documented history. The board supported the exhibition. A local newspaper ran a feature story, and other institutions began reviewing their own collections. Margaret received messages from researchers who had found similar images. Children posed to sell a story that ignored their real lives. She began building a national database of such photographs. She also traced Lena Moyer's life. Lena had worked for a rural family, then in a hotel laundry, married briefly, and died in 1967 in a nursing home. Her occupation was listed as domestic worker. Dorothy's path was harder to follow, but she died in 1953 after a life of housework. Margaret later wrote that Lena and Dorothy were photographed to create a false story of success. Their shoes were the only sign of the truth. Today, visitors still study the image. School groups discuss how history is shaped. Margaret sometimes leads tours, explaining how to read photographs closely and question comfortable stories. The photograph itself stays silent. Lena and Dorothy stand frozen, smiling as they were told, their shoes still unmatched. The truth remains there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see what the system failed to erase.